guys, so Mr. Martin wants us to discuss the meaning of blood and all the pretty horses for our project, so we have to figure out what we want to do.
Okay. I have some ideas.
Me too.
Okay, so I researched a little bit already, and my idea is basically how McCarthy uses blood to describe the different, uses blood as an adjective throughout the novel. So we see it starting on the very first few pages on the novel. On page 5, quote, "The wind was much abated, and it was very cold, and the sun sat blood red and elliptic under the wreaths of blood red clouds before him," end quote. So here McCarthy describes the sunset and basically the sand and kind of everything to show the imagery, but also even more than just imagery, he uses it to symbolize the violence later to come in the novel. So Smith, he wrote the Research Guide to American Literature. He says, quote, "Using language both sparse and lyrical, he creates a dispassionate world where human experience is marked by violence and death, and where redemption and transcendence play little, if any, part," end quote.
Well, my idea of blood as a motif incorporates violence. A lot of us can agree that violence is the basic, meaning of blood. And I think McCarthy really follows this conventional viewpoint in his writing. And once we enter the prison, blood really takes off from there. On page 201 to 202, John Grady, quote, "felt lightheaded and curiously without pain. His hands were sticky with blood, and blood was oozing through his fingers, where he held himself," end quote. This is right after he kills the Chucholero. Even more description of how violent scenes was, quote, "his clothes sagged with the weight of the blood," on page 201.
You guys see where you're both coming from, but what about the idea of blood as a motif for life and sacrifice? We see on page 7, quote, "What he loved in horses was what he loved in men, the blood and the heat of the blood that ran them. All his reverence and all his fondness and all the learnings of his life were for the iron-hearted, and they would always be so and never otherwise," end quote. This obviously is not an adjective or a description of the violence in the novel, clearly stating how the blood is running with them as a statement of life. Though this quote does mean more than just life, in the eyes of John King, quote, "wild horses symbolize the unfallen spirit and nature that he deserves. Although his love of horses means his love of humans, it does not mean that he is satisfied with his human life," end quote. This ultimately is the reason for his journey to Mexico. He wishes to escape from his old life. There is nothing left for him in Texas anymore.
Well, see, I understand both of those viewpoints, but you can't ignore McCarthy's unconventional way of his use of blood, especially in the description. Even normally you think of blood, I even think of violence, life, sacrifice, and revenge. But I think you still have to definitely take into consideration how different McCarthy uses it.
It's very clear that he does use blood as an adjective.
And also from the beginning, he uses it as a full circle ending. So on the very last page of the novel, page 302, quote, "the blood red dust blew down out of the sun." According to Fallon, quote, "the sunset could symbolize the end of his childhood and his familiar home. In the beginning, blood represents the John Grady's fight for his dream in Mexico. But towards the end, quote, "the sunset symbolizes the end of his journey and all that he had fought for. He is done fighting for his love, and he is now going to start a new journey," end quote. So you can easily tell that blood isn't just used to describe the imagery or anything of the novel, but it's also to foreshadow everything that's going to come later.
I have a point to add about love, though. During John Grady's and Alejandra's love affair on page 142, McCarthy writes, quote, "drawing blood with her teeth where he held the heel of his hand against her mouth," end quote. Blood is shown once again not as an adjective or in a scene of violence. This is clearly a motif for one of the many sacrifices John Grady has within the novel. He wants to protect his love and keep it secretive to keep it alive. Another example of a sacrifice happens in the violent scene in the prison. On page 201, right after he kills the Chucholero, quote, "from the red boutonniere blossoming on the left pocket of his blue work shirt, there spurted a thin fan of bright arterial blood. He dropped to his knees and pitched forward dead into the arms of his enemy," end quote. This symbolizes the sacrifice, John Grady killing a man, and possibly sacrifice of some of his own conscience to keep him alive.
But, you see, now we're back on the motif of violence and revenge. Another point I had to make was, towards the end, John Grady goes back to kidnap the captain, and for the sake of revenge. Within these scenes, McCarthy uses blood a lot. I mean, think of the scenes in the novel where he ends when he's shot in the leg. On page 268, McCarthy describes John Grady's leg as, quote, his leg was numb and bleeding and felt heavy as a sack of meal, and his boot was filling up with blood, end quote. The reason why John Grady is shot in the first place is because of his motive for revenge on the captain. Blood is also seen as John Grady kills the doe on page 282, quote, when he reached her, she lay blood in the grass, and he knelt with the rifle and put his hand on her neck, and she looked at him, and her eyes were warm and wet. There was no fear in them, and then she died, end quote.
But that quote relates more to life and survival than violence. John Grady needs to eat to survive in Mexico.
And I see where you're both coming from with obviously life and violence, but we don't see any blood in one of the most gruesome scenes of the entire novel, which is Gustavo's death on page 237.
That's a very good point.
That's a good point, but it could be because Alfonso was telling the story and she did not want to describe how bloody the scene was.
Yeah, I guess. And I mean, if you compare scenes of violence with blood and without blood, such as Gustavo's death, I mean, they both have such strong imagery of being very violent. Gustavo was on page 237, quote, abused and tormented, end quote, and, quote, when he begged them again to seize, one of them came forward with a pick and pried out his good eye, end quote. So this obviously is a graphic scene, and I guess it can still be considered very violent, even though there is no blood on it. So I guess that's interesting.
Okay, well, I think even though we all have different ideas in the motif, they're all relevant anyways.
Yeah, McCarthy clearly uses blood as an adjective throughout the novel, especially to describe the sunset, but also blood is clearly viewed as a source of violence and sacrifice. And in the eyes of Monroe, another source, blood represents the sacrifice that John Grady must make for all that he loves, and this is the motif that Paul brings up.
Yeah, and we can never forget about the foreshadowing that is caused by McCarthy's use of blood throughout the novel. What's kind of different that I didn't mention yet was how John Grady has to make decisions at various points in the novel where blood is seen. So especially in the very first, one of the first quotes that I said on page 5, where blood is described, that it's being described as a sunset, John Grady has to make the decision whether he wants to leave his life in Texas and go to Mexico. So also another example of this is when Blevins has to go back to the ranch and he wants to get his horse, even though, and he leaves Rollins and John Grady Cole alone, and they ask whether they want to stay with him or leave him, and they do decide to stay, and at the very end of that, Blevins splits off to try to lead the riders away. But, so on page 85, there's a mentioning of blood, so, quote, a long fan of light ran out from the east and rising sun swelled blood red along the horizon, end quote. So this is right after they do split up, and this can foreshadow the violence to come in the prison because of John Grady's decision to stay with Blevins in the end. So then he ultimately gets caught and thrown in prison.
So I think we have enough ideas. We have how McCarthy follows conventional views of blood in the ways that he shows violence, revenge, sacrifice, and life, but unconventional in his way of using blood as an adjective.
Yeah, and when blood is used as an adjective, it foreshadows violence to come.
Yeah, that's very true. So I hope that we all, these ideas work, so good job, guys.
Yeah.